Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 9 of Series 6. And the question for this evening is, can the will to value eclipse Nietzsche's will to power as a principle of life? The reading from my work, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 8. So my underlying question is again, what can we do with our lives or human existence as consciousness? Now, I'm not asking about meaning in life, which involves many presuppositions and assumptions. Instead, my claim is that problems of human existence as consciousness can be resolved in terms of value. That is, problems of morals, meaning and purpose are essentially problems of value, and that such problems can be resolved in terms of adequacy or sufficiency of value. This series of 10 workshops attempts to briefly explain different aspects of that view. Yet I should also explain that, like most other philosophical questions, these issues have not yet been definitively resolved. And these workshops are not a course in philosophy outlining established theories. They are my attempt to use theories, ideas and insights to pose and answer questions of existence. Yet this doesn't mean that these answers are not well argued or aren't coherent positions. In fact, I stand by these positions as solutions to problems of human existence. This project advocates the priority of value over other mental states, and this is what I want to say more about today. We have also discussed priorities among different kinds of values, and I will reiterate that discussion again. This prioritization of values concludes with the notions of the will to value and a sufficiency of value. Needless to say that success here would also resolve major problems in moral philosophy. So we must begin by arguing for the priority of value over other mental states like cognition, affect and will. Analytic philosophy typically classifies consciousness into cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement this classification using the 4 states of cognition, affect, will and value. And before arguing for any priority, we first need to justify the classification itself. With respect to cognition as a category, its wide employment as above mitigates the need to justify it. In justifying affect, will and value, we can refer to people like Sartre and Charles Gray Shaw. And like others, both Sartre and Shaw also employ the concept of cognition without special categorization. Yet we can make a specific comparison of the categories of affect, will and value with Sartre's constitution of the ego. Affect, will and value compare with Sartre's constitution of the ego that he describes as the states of states, qualities and action. To begin with, Sartre explains that his states are affect states like hate, love and jealousy. Sartre's notion of qualities can then be compared to what we call values. Sartre writes, "The qualities of the ego represent the ensemble of virtues, latent traits, potentialities which constitute our character and our habits. And this is consistent with a description of values. That is, even though Sartre and others use value as a standard class of mental state. Finally, we may wonder how Sartre can incorporate action, which is physical, into a constitution of the ego. Yet action need not always be physical, as in the case of mental acts and speech acts. And the force of intent required to motivate action can be described as the will. Next, the category of value might not be thought to be in need of justification. But as last week, the diversity of values and its nature as a collective might invalidate it as a concept. Yet as last week, value is a valid concept, like consciousness as a collective and a general term. And of course we will shortly be saying much more about the concept of value shortly. The point here is that the above is a sympathetic comparison of the four states of cognition, affect, will and value. And if these four states are exhaustively comprehensive, then the elimination of the others will lead us to value. Yet we now need to give some indication of why value can have preference as a human objective. Yet, as we will see, how we find value in the world determines how value might be given priority. I can note at least three ways in which values enters into the world that might give priority over other states. Firstly, values in the world might be prioritized because the world might be value laden in different ways. For example, the social scientist Tristan Engelhardt holds that knowledge is always value laden. Anthony Grayling described the world as being saturated with values. But a value laden world gets us to values, but not to the values of morals, meaning and purpose. Yet the prescriptivism of R.M. Hare held that language is value laden and therefore contains moral imperatives. But I don't believe that language can account for every aspect of our moral lives, as it would have to. And even if it did, trivial values found in language are insufficient to provide moral imperatives. Secondly, I previously argued that value is a constituent of consciousness that we thereby cannot escape. I will outline this view again shortly in order to explain how value can imply further value. And thirdly, value can address problems of morals, meaning and purpose that cognition, affect and will can't. So on this account, value can be chosen as the most viable option of the four candidates. And choosing this option with good reason resolves the problem of an unjustified value judgment. I have previously argued for this preference for value, but I can briefly reiterate this preference by going through the three alternatives. To consider the efficacy of cognition as an explanatory feature, we could discuss this in the cognitive non-cognitive debate. This debates the efficacy of cognition in explaining activities like motivation, morals, meaning and purpose. But this debate is too extensive to repeat here, so we are reducing or trying to reduce hundreds of books to a few lines. Yet I can comment that analytic philosophy usually has a preference for cognitive explanations. cognitivists usually hold that non-cognitive explanations are blind and can't guide action. Non-cognitivists hold that cognitive explanations are impotent and can't motivate behavior. As a crude example, we can ask whether we eat an apple because we desire it or just because we see an apple. In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire seems to be intuitively correct. Conversely, cognition and reason is widely and rightly accepted as a means towards some end. But moral motivation is more complex and difficult to ascertain. In the case of meaning, theories and inventions generate great excitement and are promoted as solutions in themselves. But the satisfactions do not result from the intrinsic character of these cognitions, which are contingent. The satisfactions result from the fact that a desired objective or value has been apprehended. And in my view, this and other reasons demotes cognition as a primary human objective. And a better explanation of such satisfactions can be found in terms of value. Yet cognition has much more complex functions than this, which we'll need to discuss in due course. That is, cognition not only functions as reason, as in means to an end, but as structural and supportive functions. And I've argued that these functions support value states, which are my preferred candidates. The next option to be considered is the non-cognitive state of affect that includes feelings like pleasure and happiness. Happiness is a prime example of an affect state as a classic human objective and an undeniable human good. It is endorsed by consensus, the American Constitution, by Aristotelian and even Kantian ethics. Happiness also figures in utilitarianism as its central principle of utility. And as social policy, maximum happiness for maximum number of people is difficult to dispute. But as a theory of ethics, it has serious inadequacies of quantification, justification and motivation. The main limitation of happiness, though, is its omission of elements like meaning, purpose and value. Happiness is often thought to be of intrinsic value and thereby a prime candidate as a principle of ethics or of life. But a central criticism of taking happiness as an intrinsic value is that it need not always be a value. For example, I could regard happiness as encouraging weakness, as a misguided objective, or as sinful or something like that. The point is that if happiness need not always be of value, it couldn't have intrinsic value. Yet my main criticism is that happiness is blind and doesn't entail value. It doesn't answer the why or how of life. It is, of course, very nice to be happy, but the character of human consciousness requires more than that. Human consciousness seeks understanding, purpose and value that happiness doesn't provide. And even other more refined affect states like joy and ecstasy are subject to the same criticism. But anachronistically, Nietzsche proposed an aesthetic justification that involved sensual and affective experience. But Nietzsche never completed or fully explained his account of aesthetic justification. Yet an aesthetic justification is useful in demonstrating that these four categories are hypothetical ideal types. That is, in the world, or in the mind, there are no pure states of cognition, affect, will and value. And Nietzsche's aesthetic justification draws upon both affect and value states. Moreover, such integration indicates that we shouldn't be looking for just one salient feature. Yet that doesn't prevent us from considering each of these states in turn, or from considering them in combination, as I finally do in the idea of an ongoing dialectic, as well as the fact that these four states are the building blocks of a more complex position. The will or volition is often used as an objective in such as Nietzsche's will to power or Kant's goodwill. The question here is whether will or volition is a viable primary human objective. Yet the will is another feature which should be understood in relation to other mental states. For example, we earlier saw an association of the will with action and motivation in Sartre's Constitution of the Ego. This points to the will as a vehicle of action or a means rather than a constitutive state or an objective. I have also previously described the will in a similarly functional way, which exclude it as an objective in itself. For example, wanting is a directional capacity of the will. Choice is a selective capacity of the will. And loving and hating are positive and negative affective capacities of the will. Like Nietzsche, Charles G. Shaw displays an overemphasis of the function of the will in explaining value. Shaw speaks of values being volitional or willed into existence in a Kantian or Teutonic manner. But thinkers like Heidegger and Dreyfus have criticized such a domineering conception of the will. These considerations bring us to several conclusions about the will. 1. The functional character of the will doesn't recommend it as an objective in itself. 2. The will should be understood in combination with other states, particularly value. And 3. The will can be misunderstood in isolation as a dominant force. But this view of the will as an imposing or domineering force is inconveniently an existentialist trait. Yet this is unexpectedly redressed by Sartre's emphasis on choice instead of will, discussed shortly. Yet if cognition, affect and will aren't viable objectives, then consciousness itself might be posed as an objective. But consciousness, or its increase, isn't a viable objective or solution in itself for the following reasons. 1. As a collective, it doesn't in itself specify or contain the particular properties that may provide a solution. 2. It incurs problems like anxiety, anomie, fragmentation, alienation, guilt, and awareness of finitude. And 3. Structures like temporality, divisibility, and graduation render consciousness intrinsically problematic. So my argument for value and for a principle of value has both positive and negative aspects. Its positive aspects include its usefulness in theory as well as in practical contexts like morals and meaning. Its negative aspects include demonstrating inadequacies of cognition, affect and will as principles. And negative arguments will include showing how not valuing value is contradictory. I've also already previously argued how value has been neglected and overlooked. Not to value or affirm value is contradictory, because having chosen value as the sphere of operations, it will be contradictory not to affirm value as the determining principle of that sphere. I will have more to say about this later. Yet as part of the positive argument, the significance of value can also be seen in its numerous roles in life. For example, in religion, God is the believer's highest value, and various doctrines express other values. Ethical principles are values that guide our actions, and ethical fortitude expresses a resiliency of value. And a meaningful life is worthwhile and valuable, and exhibits a broader application of value than ethics. Yet there are many kinds of values, and the above reveal their cognitive, volitional and experiential components. That is, they are about something, they have intentionality towards mental objects, and in the above cases are principles. And I am advocating a particular kind of value, that is a will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. I will shortly outline two ways in which the kind of value that I'm advocating as a principle can be established. One, that not only is value the most viable choice, but a particular principle of value is the most viable choice. I've made the case for this in previous workshops on meaning, religion and esthetic, as well as elsewhere. Two, the fact that value already exists in our lives leads inescapably to other more substantial values. That is, we enter the world with choices in front of us, and those choices necessitate other choices. Sartre puts it in terms of being condemned to be free, condemned to choose. To advance this view, I can take an argument from Sartre that the being of the self as consciousness is value. And he continues that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. Sartre builds on the idea of contrast, choice and selection as constituents of both value and consciousness. He holds choice as not just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. And that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. Sartre wants to trace selection to its ontological foundation, but in fact he doesn't do this explicitly in his writings. But we can explain and extend the notions of choice and selection with the concept of contrast. Monotone is inimical to selection, choice, value, perception, and indeed to consciousness. These capacities need contrast like a black spot on a white board. We can then say that every perception entails contrast, selection and value. We look one way and make a selection and preference that produces an antithesis or negation. Selection entails preference and value. Elimination implies contrast as a precondition of value. These may be just nascent values, Yet that is to be expected when explaining the origins of value. The point here is that value is ubiquitous in every aspect of our mental lives, and that value and consciousness are coexistent. Yet I want to mention another consequence of the coexistence of value and consciousness. That is, like consciousness, value isn't just a contingent aspect of the world, like a species of fauna or flora. Consciousness and value are fundamental species of existence, not just to the world, but even to the universe. Yet similar arguments can be made for cognition as a fundamental aspect of consciousness. So the question arises again, why give priority to value over cognition in a philosophy of life? It's because value is, as argued, paramount in theories of ethics, meaning and purpose. The primacy of value can then be shown by reiterating the function of value in the why of life, in morality and purpose. But other arguments, such as the experiential content of value and its self-validation, can also be presented. Such arguments are required in order to establish priority of value or principle of value over other states. This is because we are faced with severe constraints such as posed by Hume and More. Hume's law or principle is that a prescriptive moral ought cannot be derived from a factual is. This is thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy of identifying moral good with natural properties. This is even accepted by others, like Sartre, in that when he says ontology itself cannot formulate ethical precepts. This poses the problem that moral objectives like happiness, reason or character need not be binding or categorical. That is, a rational, sane and informed person can legitimately choose some other objective. Yet I propose a resolution of this problem by making value itself a principle of ethics, purpose and of life. That is, instead of beginning with facts, begin with values that people are immersed in, leading to other values. And by not making value a mandatory principle, but an inescapable objective for conscious beings. I indicated earlier how value is inescapable, is an inescapable aspect of consciousness with Sartre's help. But this doesn't yet amount to a principle of purpose, ethics, or of life. To do this, I want to first argue for value as a descriptive principle before arguing for value as a prescriptive principle. I previously mentioned Heger's prescriptivism. Philippa Foot followed with descriptivism. Descriptivism is the view that it is an empirical fact, that value is an empirical fact. This led to people like John Searle attempting to show how ought is derived from is. But in the view of most philosophers, Hume's principle has never been unseated. Now, I have already presented value here as a descriptive principle in human activities as an aspect of consciousness. The prescriptive principle of value I want to introduce is, of course, the principle of the will to value. And to this end, I want to compare, or rather contrast, the principle of the will to value with Nietzsche's will to power. But we should first note that Nietzsche's will to power is over-inclusive and naturalistic. There's a lot we can say here. I'll just briefly add that Heidegger rejects Nietzsche's will to power as overbearing and interprets it as the will to will. Yet Nietzsche also endorses a will to will in the idea of a free spirit that wills its own will. And Sartre further endorses the idea of the will to will in his work Being and Nothingness. This indicates a compatibility of the will to power with the will to will, which can be interpreted as the will to value. This is because value is the motivating purpose of the will, which relates the will to value to the will to will. Commentators Clark and Dudrick find what they also call the will to value in Nietzsche. Moreover, Nietzsche is quintessentially a philosopher of value, and this implies the possibility of interpreting his ideas in terms of value. Yet Nietzsche's affinity to power led him to view the will to power as a pervasive force in all biological life. As a biological drive, the will to power is excluded as a moral principle by Hume's and More's arguments. Yet the will to power can be seen as control over one's very limbs and over the environment in which we live. And as selection, choice and control, the will to power can again be seen as compatible with the will to value. Then, as an aspect of biology, we're going to ask whether animals have values or even a will to value. Animals don't have capacities of abstraction or free will, and thereby don't have moral values. But animals have desires expressed in instincts, reproduction, hunger, and the avoidance of pain. Therefore, animals can be said to have values, but not moral values or affirmations of values. The idea of animals having values reinforces the notion of value as a fundamental aspect of human life. Animals can have stronger or weaker drives to value, but they can't reflectively choose or will values. This brings us to the idea of the will to value as a prescriptive principle that humans can affirm or reject. This affirmation can take the familiar form of the ability of reflective consciousness to choose, affirm, or deny value. Robert Nozick speaks of valuing values. I'm talking here about valuing value as a general principle. Valuing value there becomes an affirmation of value, the pursuit of value, and the will to value. As a fundamental aspect of consciousness, the valuing of value or the will to value is expressed in innumerable ways. For example, the will to value is expressed in positive value states such as courage, love, or Nietzsche's amour fati. Yet Sartre's concept of a spirit of seriousness illustrates two ways of failing to value value. The spirit of seriousness is to misrepresent subjective views as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. The classic example is to say in bad faith that I have no choice. This makes a supposed error of taking the idea of I have no choice as an objective fact or value. This is a failure to value value because it is a refusal to choose, which is a fundamental property of value. Yet it is also a failure to value value because it is valuing an object or principle which has no value in itself. That is arguably only people and mental states are candidates of intrinsic value. On this view, principles or objects only have instrumental value attributed to them by people. So to take principles or objects as having intrinsic value contradicts the will to value. This view of the will to value as valuing truly intrinsic values leads to a property that we can call self-validation. Self-validation is a way of justifying systems faced with problems such as posed by human more. That is, we are overcoming the problems of foundations by making value its own foundation. Self-validating principles are used to justify logic and mathematics, but not thought possible in physics or ethics. Logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's 4 basic principles of logic. David Hilbert described mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. A self-validating system within the human sphere is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Physics isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Mathematics and logic are self-validating, but they can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. But I propose that the will to value is self-validating because the alternative is contradictory and self-negating. And systems of value need a self-validating principle due to problems such as posed by Hume. We now have 3 reasons why not to value value is contradictory, self-negating and self-defeating. 1. A failure to value value is contradictory because it denies the principle of value that we have chosen. 2. A failure to value value is found in a refusal to choose, which is a fundamental property of value. And 3. Valuing objects or principles as intrinsic values is regressive and simply erroneous. It is regressive and erroneous because it negates value as the most satisfactory human objective. That is something that has to be argued elsewhere as well as here. That is, not only to value value is also a negation of the principle of value that drives and culminates all conscious existence. But this presupposes the principle of the will to value that I have been arguing for implicitly in this paper. That is, the structures of consciousness and value constrain and direct our choices towards valuing. A related example of such constraint is Sartre's idea that we are condemned to choose, condemned to be free. But Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl offer an account of time that extends the inescapability of value. Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and a flow of becoming in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by other experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as through the diversity in space. And values must be continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. Valuing value and the will to value is therefore an inescapable property of consciousness. But the question can be posed, what does the will to value lead to or amount to? Firstly, it need not lead to anything. It could be its own reward, as a value, or as a tenable theory. But I hold that the will to value, or the value of value, results in a certain sufficiency of value. That is, the will to value evokes the kinds of value that enjoy a sufficiency of value. Sufficiencies of value are value states like self-esteem, dignity, courage, patience, and magnanimity. Yet, of course, human finitude means that sufficiencies are always insufficient and are works in progress. And value sufficiency has a certain independence of experience comparable to happiness and pleasure. That is, our happiness or pleasure or sufficiencies of value don't depend so much upon what other people think. They are an internal experience. I previously explained this sufficiency of value in detail, but I can make a couple of comparisons here. Firstly, the idea of God is a historical development of the believer's highest value, characterized by sufficiency. And Aristotle's eudaimonia is the supreme good that he also qualifies as self-sufficient. And as a supreme good, it is a moral concept, and which can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. My point is that value sufficiency is an overriding objective in both theory of value and in human experience. I noted ethical principles as values that guide our actions, and ethical fortitude expresses resilient value. A meaningful life is also a valuable and worthwhile life that is sufficient to confront loss and adversity. These examples show that the notion of value sufficiency isn't viable as a maximization of value. Value sufficiency can't be a matter of quantification, but of quality and appreciation of absence and appreciation of the other. And I repeat, human finitude means that sufficiencies of value are always insufficient and are works in progress. Human beings aren't absolute spirits with sufficient value able to confront every contingency. People need supportive ideas like religious belief, political ideals, personal support, and ideologies. And religion can be usefully cited again as a paradigm example of a supporting cognitive framework. Belief in God, doctrine and church structures provide the cognitive support that experience requires. Social esteem and other people's regard is another huge part of a supporting cognitive framework. My usual example is of a 5-year-old who needs parental approval not required by a 25-year-old. Yet both the examples of a child and of religion show that we are dealing with a process of development. And in that development, we can see a preference for independence and a sufficiency of value. As noted here and elsewhere, values, human action and experience are entangled with supporting cognitive frameworks. And it's always the case that value and value sufficiency is in a dialectical relation with cognitive structures. Yet value sufficiency is driven by the principle of value seeking further value to value as the will to value. In this dialectic, value seeks independence from cognitive support, which produces further value. And this value again needs support, which again seeks further, more independent value. This is the dialectic between the relative sufficiency of value states and supporting cognitive frameworks. Yet the relative sufficiency of value is a sufficiency expressed in such ways as moral fortitude and self-esteem. In this way, the theoretical principle of the will to value is also a principle of life and in life experience. So I conclude then with the principles of the will to value and the sufficiency of value in both theory and practice. Yet the story of these principles doesn't just begin in their efficacy in ethics and other human activities. It also begins with the inadequacies of cognition, affect and will as principles, as well as by showing how not valuing value is contradictory. And moreover, that the value of value as the will to value leads to a sufficiency of value by a natural propensity. Yet this sufficiency again isn't a maximization or quantification of value, but is a quality of value. And this sufficiency is also an insufficiency that requires some degree of cognitive support. Here is the dialectic in which value seeks independence from cognitive support, and this further value again needs support, which again seeks further value. Yet I want to clarify that the will to value is not an esoteric force. The will implies value, and both are constitutive of consciousness producing the will to value. It's a normal function of consciousness passing through time into the future. It is producing values in its selections, choices and dealing with the world. The will to value simply connects value to the will and to consciousness. But as in last week's conclusion, this perspective on value may have got ahead of itself as well as of other concerns. Concerns are more commonly about psychological experiences rather than morals, meaning and purpose. An interest in particular conceptions of things hugely eclipses their evaluative satisfactions. That is, interests almost exclusively focus on their objects rather than the experiences they evoke. So next week I will be examining the kind of cognitive frameworks that evoke value experiences. These are frameworks like coherence, symmetry and truth, as well as religion and social structures. So let me have your criticisms or comments on one of the websites like meetup.com philosophy of value workshops. Thank you.